How's it going, friends, and welcome to episode 9 of the Cynical Den Podcast. I actually recorded this episode yesterday, or at least I tried to, and I got about a full 20 minutes into the podcast, and for a reason that I don't fully understand right now even, I just said, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it right now. And I shut off the recording and deleted it. I can't tell you why I did it. I think it was because I wasn't happy with how it came out, but after recording about 20 to 25 minutes, you'd think that I'd just write it out, but no, I deleted it, and I sat there, and in the back of my mind, I think the rational side of me was saying to myself, yeah, you're not going to re-record this today, are you? It's not going to happen. You can't spend that long recording something, get rid of it, and then do it again in a couple hours. But for some reason, I still thought, yeah, I'll get back to it in a couple hours. You know, I'll get something done in a couple hours. And then I fell asleep for 3 hours, and needless to say, it didn't get recorded. Can I just say, fuck naps? Seriously, has anybody ever taken a nap and felt better after they wake up? I mean, maybe it's a combination of a few things, but every time I've had a nap, I can say from an objective standpoint, I feel worse than when I went to sleep. Mainly, I just don't feel like I've gotten any rest. I wake up feeling tired and groggy and stuff, as opposed to when I wake up in the morning, and that's usually what happens when I wake up. I feel like crap. But at least when I sleep for the full 6 or 7 hours, I can still wake up and maybe feel alright. But every time I have a nap, I've got a headache, I feel drowsy, and on top of that, I'm pissed off because I lost 3 hours out of the day. Also, I know, as soon as you wake up from a nap, you think, crap, I'm not gonna go to sleep tonight, am I? And lo and behold, I didn't go to sleep at the right time that I needed to. I needed to wake up early this morning for something. And, I'd taken the nap, and then I was still up at about 2:30, thinking, oh my god, tomorrow's gonna be the worst day ever. Now, it hasn't been the worst day ever. I mean, that was definitely an over-exaggeration on my part, but, I'd be lying to you if I said I was full of energy right now. You can probably tell with how mellow I am. I wonder if this is actually soothing as opposed to other podcast episodes where there come points where I just start shattering people's eardrums. Maybe it's a good idea to come into every podcast tired so that I can feel more mellowed. I mean, when it comes to the podcast anyway, I feel super relaxed. It's therapeutic. So I always feel therapeutic just venting frustrations with the world in a very relaxed way with people who probably have the same feelings as me. Maybe you don't loathe naps as much as I do, but you get what I mean. I've actually heard that people do these things called power naps where they nap for an hour or two every 6 or 7 hours, so they're pretty much in a perpetual state of being awake. I've heard people say this, and all I can think is, how is that even humanly possible? I can't think of many animals that are similar to humans, and by that I mean most mammals, that don't sleep for extended periods of time at one time. I can't think of a single mammal that does it. Of course, it runs the gambit from pandas that are pretty much sleeping 20 hours a day, or our little homegrown koala bears that sleep for about 22 hours a day because all their sustenance comes from shitty leaves. But then, when it comes to most things, even nocturnal mammals, they still gotta sleep for 6 or 7 hours or 8 hours at a time. And I think humans stay up a lot longer than some animals do. Plus, you got bears and shit who have to sleep for 3 months. I feel like we humans don't get enough sleep because there's too much that we're supposed to do. And I don't see how you could take what little sleep a lot of us get and break it down into 2-hour chunks. I don't see how that's humanly possible. And I'm not gonna drink coffee. I don't care. I seriously, I have no desire to be one of those people who goes, I can't wake up in the morning without coffee. Oh, it sounds like you've got an addiction. I'm being a bit of a dick here. I mean, I can understand why someone has to drink coffee in the morning, but I don't really want to develop a vice like that to where I have to buy the most bitter drink on the planet just so that I can wake up in the morning. How is that in any way helpful? Surely there would come a point where you're like, yeah, you know what, maybe I'll just I'll deal with the withdrawal symptoms of my addiction for 3 or 4 days and then I should be fine, as opposed to just feeding the addiction every morning because you just gotta have coffee. And there's nothing wrong with people liking coffee, even though I fucking hate it. The only way that I enjoy coffee is if it's like diluted as shit, which means lots of milk, and I think that's how most people do it. But then you got some people who drink like just black coffee, and I don't understand that at all. Like, when I drink black coffee, I want to rub fucking sandpaper on my tongue. Some people take coffee really seriously though, and you know, you got the people who are the connoisseurs and they're making these good coffee, and then they tell me, oh no, you just had bad coffee, you gotta have real good coffee. Like as though everybody's doing it wrong but you. You figured it out, this drink that everybody has. You're the one who's figured out the magic recipe to just have perfect coffee every day. Yeah, I totally believe that. Oh, on another note, fuck masking tape. I've been trying to hang up a Justice League poster on my wall, and now it just keeps falling down every 10 minutes. I'm looking forward to interrupting this podcast every 10 to 15 minutes and putting up this poster. It's a good poster, like, don't get me wrong, it's a nice poster, but it's just fallen down again. This shit's giving me, like, Vietnam flashbacks to when I was trying to put up, acoustic foam on my wall. This acoustic foam is the worst kind of material to try and stick things to. It will not stick. Nothing will stick to it. I got masking tape and that was woeful. Shit was not staying up. Then I even went and specifically bought this, like, adhesive, that sticks so really hard to the wall to where you've got to put a lot of force in to pull it off. Yet with the foam, it just slips off. Because the foam doesn't stick to fuck all. What I keep hearing is, oh, you gotta, like, put adhesive on and, like, glue it to the surface that you want to put it on. But I don't really want to be gluing shit to my wall. I often hear that people sit in their wardrobe to record, but that sounds way too goofy. Like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna sit in my wardrobe and record. Plus, all my scripts are on my desktop, and I'm not exactly going to be pulling, like, my 28-inch monitor in there and like, alright, time to read off the script. I even use, like, partial scripts for the podcast as well, except for this first 8 minutes has just been nonsensical ramblings. There was actually a point that we'll get to, but, I always use a script, so I don't see how that would work unless I start printing it off. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to keep going through paper and fucking ink. That's something that pisses me off, the way that you pretty much get gouged for ink. Why is it that you can buy a printer with ink for cheaper than ink itself? It makes no sense whatsoever that you can get the same product with an additional electronic device for a cheaper price than that product on its own. I understand that there's the whole thing with, you know, when you get it mass manufactured, then it goes through for cheaper, but it shouldn't be going through for such a cheap price that it costs less for me to buy a whole new printer and just toss the other one in the trash than to just buy an ink cartridge. I imagine this will become less of a problem when 3D printing becomes a thing and then people start printing off guns. This is why we can't have nice things, because they make 3D printers and some people think, yeah, you know, I'm just gonna print a gun. Thanks a bunch, guys, ruining technology for us. But enough about this first wasted 10 minutes of this show. You having a good time yet? I actually want to talk about something that is partially related to some news that's been going on lately. I recently decided to rewatch Batman Begins, a film I consider to be thoroughly underrated, and coincidentally this week, Ben Affleck announced that he wouldn't be directing the upcoming solo Batman film. It's interesting that this happened because about a month or 2 months ago, I'm pretty sure it said something on the lines of, if the script's bad, I'm not going to direct. And then 2 months later, he's not directing. Despite the bad news, since I like Ben Affleck as a director, this got me thinking about the current state of DC movies. It doesn't exactly take any clairvoyance to realize things aren't going well with DC in regards to their movies. And I know that there are a lot of retarded people who would like to claim that it's just critic bias, all the while ignoring the fact that the Dark Knight trilogy is the highest rated superhero thing ever. It's pretty much just a fact that Marvel is doing better than DC in regards to their cinematic universe. And of course, this is to be expected because Marvel's been doing it since 2008. But I think there's still just cause for concern regarding DC movies at the minute. I enjoyed Batman v Superman for what it was, but it is a fundamentally flawed film. The fact that you're expected to buy the Blu-ray copy of the film to get 30 minutes of fairly important material to understand the story better is not okay. That just shouldn't have happened. Either the script needed to be rewritten to where it could fit into an appropriate movie running time though I would have been fine with sitting there for 3 hours in the cinema. Or maybe they needed to do a couple of extra movies to build up to it. Or, like I said, they could have just released the whole 3-hour thing in cinemas. As a fan of DC Comics, I wasn't really thrilled with the way that Batman v Superman was handled in a few different regards. A lot of them are just the common grievances among people. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Unlike Batman v Superman, I just consider Suicide Squad to not be a good movie at all. It just had way too many problems. It was way too convoluted. It seemed like it wasn't edited in a way that makes sense. And again, it feels like it's out of place. It feels like that's the kind of story that should come later down the line. Plus, Jared Leto as the Joker was pretty fucking embarrassing as far as I'm concerned. And I understand that it's difficult to follow up Heath Ledger, and in terms of, you know, voice talent, like with Mark Hamill, it's a difficult thing to follow up. But he's just like the Joker in this movie is just awful. He's not good at all. And this is the Joker for the DC Cinematic Universe. This is the Joker that we've got for the rest of it. And this is the Joker who was responsible for actions that were inferred in Batman v Superman. Like, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Wonder Woman looks like it's shaping up fine, but I'm not super hyped for it, and I really don't like that we're getting Justice League before solo Flash, Aquaman, and Cyborg movies. Plus, the fact that we're not getting Green Lantern in the Justice League at all is pretty ridiculous. I mean, Hal Jordan was one of the founding members of the Justice League. He should be in the movies. I know that he may be coming later with that Green Lantern Corps film, but still, he needs to be in there from the start. The reason why I'm more harsh about this than I would have been with DC with the fact that they didn't have Spider-Man in the Avengers is the fact that DC are in a much better position when it comes to doing a cinematic universe, and they have been for a very long time compared to Marvel. The MCU started off with no Spider-Man that they finally gotten, but for Phase 3, and Spider-Man is the biggest character in Marvel. He is the Marvel superhero. They also don't have X-Men, which accounts for a huge number of important characters in the Marvel universe. And they don't even have Fantastic Four. Right from the start, Warner Brothers owns everything for DC, so this is just not a problem. They're never going to have a situation where they can't introduce characters because of licensing deals. With all of this in mind, I figured it would be worthwhile to explain how I personally would handle the DC movies. All of this is coming from a relatively impartial person because I really do like both DC and Marvel. My favorite character is Daredevil, followed closely by Batman, so you can sort of see the mix that I have here. I read both DC and Marvel comics, and I'm gonna go watch all the DC and Marvel films. However, just because I like DC doesn't mean that I'm gonna go easy on them when it comes to their movies, because when it comes to the movies, there are things that they could definitely improve. Let's get real, the current order of the films makes no fucking sense whatsoever. You got characters being introduced before they've even had their own solo films. And yes, I know that they've done this with the likes of characters like Black Panther in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Civil War, but with that it was a little bit understandable because in that they're not dead. He's not one of the central characters. He is a significant character for sure, but he's not a central character, and because of that they don't need to dedicate as much time to establishing him as they would need to do, for example, Wonder Woman, when we've only got three central characters or key characters in Batman v Superman. Plus, you know, you get Black Panther well into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You know, it's not like we're getting characters introduced before their own movies in the second Marvel movie. That's just not happening. And the only times it did happen were for characters that weren't that significant. The fact that we're getting, you know, like Flash in Justice League before we even get to see his solo debut, and it's his only feature film. And that makes no sense to me. Because of this, I'm going to recommend that DC would do phases in the same way as Marvel. I think it makes sense, especially when we're talking about comic book movies. You've got everything building up to a big crossover film. And I think that's just a good way of going about it. So, of course, Man of Steel kicks off the DCEU, and this makes sense because it's Superman. You gotta have Superman to kick it off. But then it should have been followed by a solo Batman film, properly legitimizing this version of Batman in this universe. Yes, we're all familiar with Batman, and there have been 7 movies, but you gotta remember that all of that is totally irrelevant to this version of Batman. It's important that we fully see his story play out, that they fully flesh out Gotham in this universe, which is something that they just did not do well in Batman v Superman. They needed to spend a whole movie establishing him, Gotham, establishing foes like the League of Shadows, even though, you know, they don't need to be the central antagonist, because they were the overarching threat in the Dark Knight trilogy. You could have a different villain. Not necessarily the Joker, you can probably save him for later, but you could go with, you know, Harvey Dent, you could bring in Killer Croc if you wanted to, Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy. I mean, there's a huge rogues gallery of people that you can choose for Batman. You could probably even do like 2 villains in the movie, because, you know, once you get to 3, then you start to get to the Spider-Man 3 problem, but you could definitely have fitted 2 antagonists into a solo Batman film. Plus, it allows you to potentially introduce characters like Robin, and especially important would be Commissioner Gordon, because you gotta have him. He was there from the very start for Batman comics, and it seems odd to watch a Batman movie without Commissioner Gordon. It doesn't feel right to me. You follow that up with Wonder Woman, and that's all good. I'm not gonna judge the Wonder Woman film until it comes out, so I'm not really going to offer any criticism as to what they could have done. But then you follow up that with a second Superman film featuring Brainiac if you wanted to, and then Batman v Superman to wrap up phase 1. So some big changes for Batman v Superman are, key one, Batman doesn't kill anybody, because I really dislike that. And yes, I know that there are people who say things like, well, he killed people in the comics. Yes, we know that, but throughout most of his history, and particularly in terms of pretty much all of his on-screen portrayals, Batman doesn't kill people, and the only times where it happened is where it was very necessary. When you watch Batman v Superman, there's no way you can't shake the feeling that some of the brutality in terms of Batman's fighting and him driving in the Batmobile was over the top. The fact that he would basically crash a car, tie a tether to it, and then sling it around with the dudes inside to blow up another car. Or the way that he's, you know, blowing dudes up with grenades, that's just, it doesn't feel right. I mean, the whole thing with Batman is that he doesn't kill people. Throughout most of his history, he doesn't kill people. Plain and fucking simple. That's what differentiates Batman from the likes of the Punisher. Now, the most important thing is not to kill off Superman in Batman v Superman. It's way too premature. He's only been in 2 movies and you kill him off. That's way too early, because when that happens, the people in the audience, instead of getting the reaction of, oh damn, are thinking, he's gonna come back, isn't he? Yeah, he's gonna come back. And then once you get to the end credits, yeah, he's not gonna be dead. I mean, one of the big issues with this whole cinematic universe thing is you know who's gonna live because their contract's still going, but it's not a right time to have him die. I also don't think it's the right time to have Batman and Superman basically team up. They should beat the shit out of each other and go their separate ways for the time being. Oh yeah, no Doomsday. No fucking Doomsday, alright? And when you do them, eventually, don't do them shit like you did in that movie. For phase 2, kick it off with Batman 2. And in this one, we can set it a few years later, throw a few new characters in, like Batgirl, who will be setting up when we get to a Birds of Prey film in phase 3. And then you can throw in, you know, your more, like, iconic villains like the Joker, or Penguin, perhaps. You got tons of choices when it comes to Batman. I mean, you can pretty much pick whatever. And I personally don't have an issue with them doing a villain that they've already done in previous films, like the Riddler or anything like that. I feel like that's fine. Then we follow up Batman 2 with Flash, Aquaman, Green Lantern, and Cyborg, so that we have all of these characters introduced before the Justice League movie. You follow it up with Wonder Woman 2, and then Justice League with the full team. Keep in mind that while we're going along, other characters can be introduced in these movies. You get Catwoman in Batman, you can put Supergirl and Man of Steel 2, Sinestro and Green Lantern. You pretty much get the idea. Team up should be starting to happen, the way that I see it. By this point, we need to start seeing characters team up. Not necessarily the whole Justice League, but, you know, even things where Flash shows up to help out Aquaman or anything like that. For phase 3, this is where you can start getting a little bit more creative and throwing in slightly more obscure characters or more of the fan service. You have some sequels following up Justice League, and this will depend on which stories kind of need to be elaborated on. Now you throw in Suicide Squad, and then you have the introduction of characters like Green Arrow, Shazam, Nightwing, Supergirl, and the Birds of Prey movie. For good measure, I'd also like to throw in a solo Deathstroke movie. I mean, I'm obviously biased in this regard since Deathstroke is one of my favorite characters, but I'd pay good money to see that. However, the most important film leading up to the second Justice League movie will be Son of Krypton, which was the working title for one of the Superman films in the planned trilogy they had before they scrapped it for the DCEU. And in this one, Doomsday kills Superman, but for real, he's dead and he's not coming back. So now when we come into Justice League 2, the stakes are much higher because Darkseid rocks up and they're pretty much fucked and there's no get out of jail free card because, like I said, Supes ain't coming back. He's dead. So you've got the most powerful member of the Justice League in the ground, and you've got the remainder of the Justice League without the proper leader of the team sort of in shambles trying to fight back against Darkseid. I just think that would be a cool way to raise the stakes, and it would add it would add a pretty major difference between DC and Marvel in that DC would have the balls to kill off characters. As much as I enjoyed Civil War, one of the big issues I had with it was that nobody died and that you get the impression that everything's pretty much going to be fine in a few movies. At the very least, even Rhodes, at the very least, should have died in Civil War. It just doesn't feel like there's enough stakes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe because people don't die. And this is one of the things that I liked about Man of Steel. I know a lot of people were like, oh, there was too much collateral damage, but I felt that was real. It just doesn't feel right when I'm watching the Avengers and I'm just seeing all of the minions miss all of the civilians. And then when you come to Civil War and they're saying like, oh, we had like 200 casualties in New York, I'd be like, dude, you should consider yourself lucky that you had like 200 casualties in a war in the middle of Manhattan. I would say count your losses. That's pretty good. No need for the courts. Like, that's fine. Those are acceptable casualties. Whereas I felt that the way that it was handled in Man of Steel and then into Batman v Superman was good. The fact that they acknowledged that when, Superman showed up and then they started using that machine to destroy Metropolis, how many people it killed and how much destruction it caused. Like, that's something that they need to focus on. Because personally, I'm one of those people who thinks the tone of the DCEU is good as it is right now in terms of being not necessarily realistic, but feeling authentic to what would actually be going on, as well as that darker tone. Because while the DCEU has flaws, the things that I feel that it does really well by comparison to Marvel right now is tone, visuals, and music, which all establish atmosphere. Like, these movies are more visually interesting than what they're doing with DC, where it's, with Marvel, I mean, which has kind of a bit of a washed out color palette, whereas the DC one feels more stylized. And you can tell with Zack Snyder because while I feel like he has issues in terms of his directing, one thing he does really well is visual. Lining up these really awesome shots that parallel the comics. That's something I like about him. He's a very good visual director, and that's something that those movies definitely need to get props for, and that I feel, while being criticized fairly so, there's that kind of thing is overlooked. To get back to what I was saying, each crossover film, by doing it the way that I've explained, each crossover film has a lot less to achieve because Batman v Superman could have been a better film were it not for the fact that they had to try and set up Batman and Wonder Woman. And also the fact that, one of the issues that just would need to be fixed is getting the proper Lex Luthor from the comics. The proper one. I'm not talking about these people who reference one or two story arcs where Lex Luthor acted this way. I'm talking about the proper, scheming, manipulative Lex Luthor. The proper one. We need him. Because he's one of the best villains that DC has. In much the same way as the Joker. Though they are clearly very different. We need to have that proper Lex Luthor. Getting back to what I'm saying, there'll be more dramatic crescendos in terms of each of the main films because there's more development. If you have these solo Batman films and you have the toll that's taken on Batman from his crime fighting and the people that he loses, and plus you get more of Alfred in terms of Jeremy Irons as Alfred, like that's just a good thing. But in terms of it would give him more development. It would flesh out why Superman and Batman would be at odds with each other. These are all things that just help the crossover movies. Now, this is a little bit more of a left field sort of idea that I think would be interesting if they did it. But as opposed to doing a story beat where Superman gets killed, in that Son of Krypton film, you could potentially have a completely different divergence in the plot where you have Doomsday kill Lois Lane and his unborn kid. You see where I'm going with this? You could do Injustice in the DCEU and have them all fighting. I mean, obviously it's a highly adjusted one because you're not going to have any parallel universe stuff, but how fucking cool would that be to see all of these superheroes fighting in sort of a long war scenario in the DCEU? That would just be cool. That would be awesome. It means that characters get killed and it gives it a big edge over the MCU. I don't think they're going to do it that way. I think they're setting up Flashpoint at the minute, but you see what I'm getting at. Like, there's this potential to really incorporate the comics and introduce the casual audience to these comic book story arcs in not necessarily a fully faithful way, but in an interesting way. On a different note, I think that it would be a good idea for them to if this was in my world, there wouldn't be any of this Arrowverse stuff in terms of the TV shows. All the TV shows that they do for the less well-known characters, which they could do for some of the ideas I had. You could have a Nightwing TV show or something like that, in the same way that Marvel's doing it with Netflix, because those Netflix shows work fantastically. Daredevil is flat out the best part of the MCU, and it works well as a show. And to have it all together in the same universe means there's no confusion and it's all cohesive, because right now the divide between the movies and the TV shows, and even now with like the new sitcom, Powerless or whatever it's called, that's not set in the same as the Arrowverse, it's really confusing for a lot of people. Basically, that's how I would handle the DC cinematic universe. I don't know if those are good ideas. Obviously, you know, I'm not a professional writer. Maybe one day, but not at the minute. But I think those are just my ideas on how I feel that would improve the DC cinematic universe. The key piece of advice I would give to DC is don't rush it. Allow for it to build on its own, because when you rush it, things get sloppy and it turns people off. There's nothing wrong with building up to it. I know that this is a bubble that will eventually burst, because a lot of the people who love these movies don't even know anything about the comics, like people like me or other people. But it's still worth doing a slow build for the benefit of the quality of these movies, because they have the potential to be a lot better. They really do. This is coming from a place of love, a love for these characters and the DC universe. You can, in the same way that I really like the Marvel universe, you know, you can build up to it and do a really good cinematic universe if you just put your head to it and you're just more patient. That's the key thing. Be patient. Let it grow on its own. People like these characters. Don't force it. Don't rush it. I think it's about time for the Q&A section. Remember, if you have a question, feel free to leave it in the comments section of this podcast episode, and we'll get around to it in the next episode. Today's question comes from Mr. Goodnight Good Luck, who asks, what do you think makes up elements of good writing in video games, movies, books, and TV shows? I know I'm going to sound like a bit of an egotistical ass right now, but I feel like far too many stories are poorly written. Most TV shows aren't good, and I don't think many people can disagree with this statement. For every Mr. Robot, you've got 10 shitty sitcoms that are absolutely humorless. When we're talking about films, I think a very pervasive issue that you'll see in some major films in particular is their inability to develop interesting characters, mainly because a lot of blockbuster films have archetypal characters. The most common one that you'll see in movies is the blank slate that everybody can relate to because they have absolutely no character. Lots of films do this. I think films like Twilight are a perfect example of the blank slate character. Someone so dull, so monotonous, and so lacking in any unique personality that literally any teenage girl can project themselves onto her and feel like the story was written for them. It's very manipulative because I don't, unless you're really, I think that when you see a lot of these characters that are blank slates, it's not due to writing inability, but due to the fact that a lot of people know that that's the best way to exploit people's emotions to make more money on your product. All of the best characters, all of the most memorable characters that you know of in film, TV, and video games are interesting because they're not stereotypes, they're not archetypal, they're very unique. Nobody can really relate to Hannibal Lecter or Walter White, but that's because they're unique characters. The more unique they are, the more that they may potentially alienate some people, but the more fleshed out they will be. And that takes a lot of skill to develop such a fully realized character that feels like a real person as opposed to just an actor. Of course, part of that relies on the ability of the actor, and in that case you got Bryan Cranston, who's fantastic. But good writing forms the backbone, because even the best actors can be weighed down by shitty writing. Character development also needs to feel logical, and far too many, specifically genres of stories, fail to do this. Far too fucking many romantic comedies involve the main characters getting irrationally angry at each other just to transition the second act into the third act. It's usually some misunderstanding or something where it could be easily resolved by the characters just speaking to each other like normal people would, but instead they just storm off irrationally and not listening to what the other person is saying to set up conflict to spark the third act. You will see this in most shitty romantic comedy movies. Like, I bet you, if you're looking for this, you will notice it in almost every bad romantic comedy. Bad dialogue is at the crux of this issue, where plot points are made in advance and then they write the story in a way to lead to certain plot points. Like you can tell that they had a checklist of things that they wanted to do, and they're like, all right, we got to write the dialogue in a way that leads to it. It's basically where, like, the dialogue is written to enable plot points, which is just fucking bad writing. I mean, of course, dialogue does this, but it should be masked in a way that it's not so blatantly transparent. Prime examples of this are misunderstandings that are driven by the fact that nobody is able to communicate like a proper human being in situations where the issue could be clarified in like one sentence. Characters storming off when they overhear something but don't stay and listen to the whole context, or don't just go up to the person and ask, hey, can I clarify what this means? You know, things that normal people do. All stories also need to have good structure. The rule of three is beginning, middle, and end, but I think a lot of films and TV shows do understand this, because the whole 3-act structure is pretty much like writing 101. Every writer understands these to some degree. A big issue with a lot of movies, I feel right now, is just that they outright explain the plot. You know, subtlety is important. When you're writing a good story, it's better to show rather than tell. This isn't always true. I mean, 1984 was pretty upfront with its point. There were multiple points where characters would just basically explain it. But that makes sense because they're tackling very deep philosophical questions to where you really need to talk about it in depth. And again, this can be handled well. A good example was in Daredevil, where you had Matt and the Punisher on the roof arguing about their differing ideologies on fighting crime. Like, that felt good because even though they basically were just flat out stating their positions, it felt organic and it was well written. It's okay to, in some way, like, explain what point you're trying to make, but you have to try and go about it in a way that feels organic and not pandering. You don't want to lecture people. You don't want to basically just say, here, now shut up, and this character's going to explain everything to you. Video games is an interesting topic to talk about when it comes to writing, because it's a lot more challenging just due to how different it is from a movie or a book. A movie only has to worry about telling its story, whereas the core of a video game is gameplay, not story. At the end of the day, you have to play video games. You're probably wondering what this means, but what this really means for a story is that instead of being written solely to tell a story and structured in a way that benefits nothing but the story, you've got writers dealing with a product that has been designed to have specific areas of gameplay that need to be accommodated, and where they fit contextually often ends up coming down to the writer having to figure it out, as opposed to the writer establishing the context. You can see this in a lot of military shooters. I've talked about this before, where it just feels like they're jumping between settings, because it's like, okay, we want to level in the snow, now we want to level in the jungle, we want to level in a big city, now go figure it out. And this is just a bad position for a writer to be in. So while a lot of video game stories aren't well written, I often empathize with the writer, because that is just a difficult position to be put in. This is the reason why a lot of the games that have good stories are the ones that focus entirely on stories. Often adventure games like Monkey Island, where because it's all story and it's written in a way that it's basically all supposed to support the story. So the gameplay sections feel properly contextualized. On the other end of the spectrum, you have games like Tomb Raider that just feel like the gameplay is not designed to accommodate what's going on in terms of the story at all. And in fact, BioShock Infinite is another example. Like, I think Bioshock Infinite would have been better served if it wasn't a shooter. Whereas conversely, you look at some of these cinematic platformers like Oddworld, where the story feels like it makes sense in conjunction with the gameplay because it lends together, as opposed to having a story that's meant to be really emotional between two characters that is constantly interjected by gunfights. The story has to accommodate the levels. That's the big issue for video game writing. Also, the fact that a lot of, like, you know, mainstream games feature combat, that limits the kind of stories you can tell, because when you look at most movies, and especially a lot of the best movies, a lot of them don't have action. Of course, it depends on what metric you're talking about. A lot of my favorite movies have action, but a lot of the, you know, widely considered to be good movies like Casablanca and the like, don't feature action. And films like The Godfather that have violence are not, like, action heavy because they need to spend a lot more time on dialogue. Whereas when you've got so many games that have violence, it definitely limits the kind of stories that you can tell. Basically, what I'm trying to say is core tenets of good writing: solid structure, beginning, middle, and end, logical character development, and authentic writing. Not necessarily realistic, but believable in the scenario presented. I hope that answers your question. That about does it for this episode of the Cynical Den Podcast. Thanks again for watching. Feel free to check out Crude Penguin stuff on crudepenguin.com and Twitter and Facebook. All of the links are available in the description. I'm not going to spend any time teasing projects. I'm just going to keep saying what I've been saying for a few weeks. I'm working on it, and hopefully when some of these projects get done, there'll be some really good content for you to enjoy. Right now, I'm just working on a few projects, trying to get the ball rolling. It's mostly been writing and conceptualizing. Hopefully I'll have something to show you in 1 or 2 months, though it might be a lot longer than that. But just rest assured, even though you may not see it, I am working on a lot of stuff behind the scenes that will hopefully surprise and entertain you. That does it for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Cynical Den Podcast.